Good morning, and welcome to all of you for joining the Gulf International Forum. Thanks for taking the time to be part of this conversation. We're meeting at a moment when the Middle East is approaching one of its most consequential inflection points in years. Iran is under mounting domestic pressure while simultaneously sitting at the center of a widening, perhaps regionally widening confrontation. The risk of escalation is no longer theoretical. Deterrence is being tested, alliances are being recalibrated, and the margin for miscalculation is shrinking. Decisions made in Tehran, in Washington, and in the Gulf capitals in the coming weeks and months could define the region's security landscape for years to come. The stakes are not abstract. They involve the stability of an entire region, the security of global energy markets, and the possibility of a conflict whose consequences would extend far beyond the Middle East. Uh, it is a bit scary. I look forward to a candid and rigorous conversation. Today's discussion asks a difficult but necessary question. Are we moving towards containment, towards confrontation, or just sitting in some fragile and unstable equilibrium? To explore that, we are joined by an exceptional panel. Dr. Dina Esfandiary is the Middle East geoeconomics lead for Bloomberg Economics, based in Geneva. Previously, she worked at the International Crisis Group, the Harvard Kennedy School at King's College London, and the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Alex Vatanka is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute and founder of the Iran program at MEI. Alex is also a senior fellow in Middle East Studies at the U.S. Air Force Special Operations School at Hurlburt Airfield and teaches as an adjunct professor at DSIS AS at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Ross Harrison is a senior fellow and book series editor at the Middle East Institute, MEI. He recently released a new book, Decoding Iran's Foreign Policy. That will be a good one, Ross. Ross is also a faculty member in the Political Science Department at the University of Pittsburgh, where he teaches courses on Middle East politics and U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. Let's kick this off with Dina. Dina, how do the ongoing talks between Steve Witkoff and Abbas Araghchi reflect Washington and Tehran's respective strategic priorities? And to what extent are these negotiations designed to stabilize the crisis versus manage escalation and amid domestic unrest in Iran?
Sure. First, a big thank you for having me. So, in terms of strategic priorities, I think the US's strategic priorities have been made pretty clear. I think the US aims to eliminate the threat of Iran's nuclear program, to eliminate the threat of its missile program, and also to get rid of the threat that is posed by Iran's relationship with its proxies in the region, although that has been diminished somewhat by Israel over the course of the last 2 years. The one that's a question mark is the issue of regime change. It sounds like the Trump administration is pursuing it, but it's obviously not a very clear stated goal. What about Iran's strategic priorities? Well, I think with Iran, it really depends who you ask. If you talk to some of the technocrats in Tehran that are a part of the leadership at the moment, they want to ensure that the US threat is contained without giving up too much in the negotiations. They want to regain control and consolidate themselves domestically before having the bandwidth to even think about tackling anything else. That bandwidth, by the way, in my view, is going to be limited no matter what happens. They want a diplomatic outcome that's, quote, fair, pursued on equal footing, and very much focused on the nuclear program, though there appears to be some willingness to discuss the region. The problem is that I think we're way past that right now. The protests and the violent crackdown on protesters in the last month has really stripped whatever legitimacy the system had in place. Trump's view of Iran is that it's very weak, it's on the verge of collapse, and so Trump is likely to really push for Iran's capitulation in order to avoid the airstrikes that he's threatened. And of course, Israel's preference is to push for a tougher deal. But so these are the technocrats in Iran. If you talk to some of the hardliners in Iran, I think their view is much tougher. They feel like they didn't do enough last time when Iran was attacked. They feel like deterrence needs to be reestablished. So there's a need to basically go all out in response to potential military strikes. I think many within the Iranian system see this as a very existential moment. And so for them, talks are either a waste of time or intended to buy time so that they can prepare for retaliation. So ultimately, I think the problem is that the two sides really are far too far apart. Um, and because the US is essentially going to be asking for capitulation, this is something that Iran is unlikely to do, and it feels it can't do because if it does, it would essentially be opening up the door to the end of the Islamic Republic.
Sorry. Alex, you're next in line. In the event of a direct confrontation with the United States, would you expect protests to subside in the name of national unity or intensify as an opportunity to challenge a regime under external pressure? And why in either case?
Thanks, Patrick. Great to be with you and Dina and Ross. Look, I think, what happened in early January was something Iranian history has not witnessed before. A regime that came out with the biggest guns it could muster and killed tens of thousands of its own, basically children. I mean, if you look at the demographics, most of the people who were killed by this Islamist regime were in the demographic age of 15 to 25. People who are born way after the revolution of 1979. And they have genuine grievances, and they're out in the streets. And what does the regime do? It kills them in large numbers because it has no solution. It calls them names. It calls them foreign agents. It calls them Mossad or CIA agents. And it hopes that because it could kill so many in so few hours over the course of 2 days, that this is going to put Iranian society in a state of shock for years to come. So the regime's hoping that it's kind of contained the situation, because surely nobody would be stupid enough, if I could be crude, to come out again and face this regime. That's the gamble. That's the gamble that Ali Khamenei, in his speech, when he came out and gave the green light, I mean, shouldn't be forgotten. It was a green light that came from Ali Khamenei himself. He said, in so many words, basically go out there and neutralize these people. There is a unusual phenomenon going on in Iranian society, Patrick. You have this element, this reality of dehumanization on both parts. So the protesters don't look at the security forces as Iranians, maybe even not even as human beings. And the same is true as the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, the Basij, the law enforcement. They don't consider the protesters as fellow citizens, as Iranians. This is why you ended up with this bloodbath. And going back to the issue of demographics, this is the new Iran, where the regime, having about to celebrate 47 years in power, has alienated such a large part of Iranian society. People who don't remember anything, were not even born in 1979. So I think this is going to be the sort of the future, the radicalization of Iranian society. You already this last few days have seen the regime. And when I say regime, I mean the deep state. I mean Khamenei. I mean the Revolutionary Guards. I mean the intelligence services, whether it's the Ministry of Intelligence or the intelligence branch of the Revolutionary Guards. What have they done in the last few days? They've tried to pick up the remnants of what's left of the so-called reformist movement of what became with Mohammad Khatami in the late 1990s. They're picking them up. They're putting them in prison. What is their crime? They're asking the obvious. How much more killing can you do in the name of staying in power? And for that questioning, they're being arrested. So Khamenei is not looking to have a dialogue with its own people. What he wants to do is to essentially contain. If it means mass killing, then so be it. That seems to be his preference. And then once he has his home front covered, if you will, he might then entertain the idea of some kind of a negotiations or some kind of a compromise with the Americans. That remains to be seen. That comes down to what Trump wants. And we've heard from J.D. Vance just in the last few hours that the file of Iran is in the hands of one man, that's Donald Trump. So I think if the Americans decided to attack Iran, the Iranian gamble right now is that the U.S., even with this massive buildup, is not preparing for an occupation of Iran. In other words, they're not going to land with boots on the ground. It will be kinetic. It will be from the air. And the regime in Tehran is gambling that it can overcome that. That's not going to bring the regime down. And in fact, and you were reading this in some of the commentary coming from media close to the Revolutionary Guards, limited war is something many in Iran, in the hardline so-called circles, although they're tiny in terms of numbers, percentage, 5% of Iranian society might support what the hardliners want to do. But this group might welcome a limited war because it just gives them more options to crack down even more at home if that's what they need to do. This is what they live off, being in a securitized environment. That's the best place for them to be, because then they don't have to be accountable in any way. So if there are strikes by the United States, the big question is, given what I just told you, this extremely angry younger population, would they come out and protest again? I think very likely. But is it organized enough to result in sort of erosion of the foundations of the regime? That's the big question mark. And I don't think the Trump administration has gotten that far to be able to have a blueprint for that. It might come up with a blueprint. I don't think this Iran-U.S. battle is going to end anytime soon. It could be weeks, months, maybe even years. I mean, Trump is in the White House for 3 more years. So if I was Iran, I wouldn't be so comfortable. If I was the hardliners, Khamenei, I wouldn't be so comfortable and confident that I can overcome the challenges that they're facing both domestically and in the realm of foreign policy.
Thank you, Alex. Ross, coming home, how is Washington likely to respond diplomatically, militarily, and strategically to Iran's internal crisis under 2 scenarios? One in which negotiations advance, and another in which talks collapse or fail to materialize.
I think, thank you, Patrick, and it's an honor to be here with Dina and Alex. I think it's important that we look at sort of the asymmetry between Washington and Tehran in terms of how they're viewing the current talks or diplomatic engagement. I hesitate to call them negotiations, but certainly engagements, because there is an asymmetry. It's something I think that Dina alluded to earlier, and that is that for Washington, I don't believe they see the current round of diplomatic engagement that started in Oman and I believe is now moving to Rome next round. I don't think they believe that that's a negotiation. I think they see it as an ultimatum and as a démarche in a way, sort of a statement of U.S. intentions should the Iranians not capitulate. And the biggest piece of evidence for that, obviously, is Admiral Cooper being part of the team that went to Oman to indicate that there is military action. Admiral Cooper is heading up the Armada, or the naval presence, and very close to Iran shores. So I think from the U.S. standpoint, this is not really a negotiation. I think from the Iranian standpoint, I think they get the same message. They see it that way too, because in the last round of negotiations last June, negotiations were taking place. There were negotiations scheduled, and the next round of negotiations were scheduled, and both Israel and the United States attacked Iran. So I think Iran understands that what's at stake here. I think the question is, why are they playing? Why are they actually negotiating? Why are they? And I think one of the things we have to consider there is that they're doing that to some degree to show good faith, perhaps, but also the target audience, I think, is our Gulf Arab allies who were counseling Trump to perhaps pursue an authentic diplomatic track rather than move to kinetic action. So I think that's one of the objectives that they have. But they also don't see this as a real negotiation. So I think there's a big wide spread in terms of how Washington is viewing this round. and also how Tehran is. And I think the second piece that I think militates against success, if I'm sort of putting my pessimistic hat on here, which is easy to do in the current situation in the Middle East, is that both parties in some ways are politically bound. So how is the U.S. politically bound? Well, I think they're bound by the fact that that Trump has to do something that, at least on paper or in the public eye, is better than the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal that he walked out of in 2018. So if the position is zero enrichment, well, that's an improvement upon the JCPOA, because the JCPOA brought enrichment down from extremely high levels, weapons grade levels, down to about 3%, which is for civilian use. So, and the Iranian position is, we're not going to get rid of enrichment. We will negotiate the level of enrichment. So I think if Trump is not able to get a better deal than the JCPOA, then he's in a box. And the other thing is, he put himself out there during the protests that Alex alluded to, saying that I'm here for you. We're gonna come to your assistance. So I think in terms of being boxed into some kind of military action, he himself has politically put himself in a box. And the Iranians are a bit in a box, right? They believe that any kind of flexibility is interpreted by Washington as weakness. So they are very much hesitant to actually show flexibility on any of the files. I think there's some files they might show more flexibility than others, but they're hesitant because they believe that any weakness will then be exploited by the U.S. and rather than precluding military action, could actually elicit or precipitate military action. And the other box in, I think they're clearly coming out of the protests, the bloody protests, the carnage that occurred just last month. They also believe that if they show weakness, perhaps in the negotiations, that will become a stimulant for further protests or fuel for further protests. So I think both parties have limited range of options based upon their political constraints. And I think the last one, which I think is very, very important, is on the U.S. side, is we really don't have a bench. You know, Alex alluded to the fact that, you know, there's one man holding the file, and that's Donald Trump. But even if you go the next level down, you've got basically Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, a non-government employee, and Admiral Cooper. And there is not the kind of bench strength you need to deal with the complexities of this kind of a file. So I think the notion of this as being a sincere negotiation that can lead somewhere, I think, is questionable at this point. And I'll stop there.
You took your last comment, Ross, about how one man makes the decisions and the rest of the bench is really thin. You just spoiled the first question that I was planning on asking when this was over.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. Dina, how are the GCC states and Turkey engaging with or positioning themselves around the ongoing negotiations between Witkoff and Arakci? What interests, leverage, and constraints shape their emphasis on de-escalation, regional stability, and preventing an uncontained conflict? That may be the toughest question so far.
Yeah. So I think first, in terms of how Iran views the expansion of the number of people involved in these talks, that in itself is interesting. I think in the talks that led up to the JCPOA, even the talks that happened after Trump pulled out of the JCPOA, Iran was very anti-expanding the number of players in these talks. They felt that the regionals were more of a nuisance, they weren't needed, there was very little trust. And it was much more validating and legitimizing to talk to the big powers, the Americas, the Europeans, the Chinese, the Russians. There was no need for the region. Add to that the region's main concern really was regional stability and Iran's involvement in Arab countries, and it made Iran even more adamant that it didn't want anybody else but the P5+1 involved in these talks. Fast forward to today, and the situation is very different. Iran is objectively weakened, and the specter of war really is hanging over its head. The threat of airstrikes is very credible. I think for a very long time when the Israelis threatened to attack Iran, it wasn't really a credible threat. But after the June war, it is. And from Tehran's perspective, countries in the region really have an incentive to avoid escalation, to avoid US airstrikes on Iran, because they will be the ones to feel the blowback. So Tehran now views them as a voice of reason. Sorry. In terms of the GCC and Turkey, I think they are very clearly worried about war and escalation. Iran has not made it a secret that if it faces US airstrikes, then it is likely to retaliate against the region. And its options go across a wide spectrum. So it's likely to target Israel in the first place. And keep in mind that after the 12-day war, while Iran suffered serious losses, it also used that war to basically gain greater insight into what to target in Israel, how to go around Israeli missile defenses. And so it progressively became more successful with its attacks in Israel. And clearly that will help it today. It is likely to also target US bases in the region and, of course, in the Gulf Arab states. And it has threatened to target energy infrastructure and potentially even close the straits, which would, of course, impact oil and energy markets globally. So it's no longer just contained to the region. These impact, regional stability, regional business and prosperity, growth prospects. It impacts the Gulf's image that they have curated and built over the last few decades of being a haven of stability in an unstable Middle East. And I think the Gulf Arab states are very genuinely worried that their security is at risk, that they're going to have to choose between the US, pledging allegiance to the US, or helping Iran out of a crisis, because at the end of the day, Iran is their neighbor. And so it really puts everybody in a tough spot. So today they're working quite hard to de-escalate the situation. Many countries in the region have good ties to Trump. They have Trump's ear. And so they believe that if more of them are involved in these negotiations rather than one mediator or one facilitator, then it will be easier for more of them to impress upon President Trump that war is bad. If you look at, for example, Turkey's relationship or Erdogan's relationship with Trump over the last little while, it was a shaky bromance, but now it seems to be a booming bromance. And so I think Iran, despite some of its misgivings with trusting Turkey, believes that Erdogan might be able to help. And of course, the fact that all of these countries in the region are now, shuttling back and forth and trying to mediate between the two sides, both countries in the region and the Iranians feel that that will be a significant counterweight to Israeli influence over President Trump. The more of them sit together, the heavier the counterbalance is. I'll stop there.
Alex, continuing along the same way, for unexpected consequences or unexpected events. What risk does Iran face if domestic protests break out again during the negotiations and either prolong instability, threaten regime institutions, and perhaps even affect regime or national cohesion?
So, Patrick, the way I look at it is the only thing the regime right now has in terms of dealing with the people and their demands, their anger, is really what we discussed earlier. It's to use brute force to tame, contain, scatter, whatever you want to call it. That's the only thing that the regime seems to be willing to contemplate in terms of how to deal with the society that is so upset about how things have evolved and where they are at right now. I would point to two other things that I think are maybe relevant today. One is obviously the economy is in this state of a disastrous state. There's no hope at the end of the tunnel, and it's not just sanctions. Obviously, sanctions are a main part of where Iran is. But there's a lot more going on here in terms of mismanagement, corruption, lack of accountability. The whole system, in terms of its structures, which, by the way, Ali Khamenei has overseen since 1989, therefore is more guilty of mismanaging than anyone else, is not something that you can blame on sanctions. This is internal. This is the mafia state that Iran has become, where everybody's looking to just fill their pockets and they couldn't care less about the national interest, where money disappears. Even when they bring crude oil export revenue back to Iran, money disappears. So there is no silver bullet that I can point to in the economic area and say, this could help the regime. Maybe they could cut a deal with the Americans, get some limited sanctions relief. That will help them fill people's stomachs again, and that might reduce tensions in society. That's unlikely to happen. Even in the best case of scenarios, if you had some kind of a deal where the Iranians suspended enrichment, say, for the duration of Trump's term in office, and they got significant sanctions relief, the money that's going to come in is going to help grease the wheels of this corrupt system. It's not necessarily going to trickle down to everyone in society. And by the way, I should point out, I saw one of the questions was talking about what was different about these latest protests compared to before. What is very different in many ways, although it's been a trend for some time, is that these political protests and mobilizations are now happening across the nation. I mean, I think one former Iranian reformer, actually not former, he's still a reformist, he was just arrested, from what I understand in the media reports. He pointed out that 1.5 million Iranians participated in a nationwide protest that impacted 400 different locations, 400 different towns and 900 different locations across the country, right? So this is the amount of anger you have to deal with. And even if you had a nuclear deal and some sanctions relief, I don't know if the regime can hope that that's going to be enough to, if you will, try and rebuild some of these burned bridges with the people. I really don't think it's realistic. The regime has no way of recovering. It really has no legitimacy in the eyes of vast majority of Iranians, which, there was a time in the past, you could say Iranians bought into the idea of regime would eventually listen to reason, that you could push for gradual change instead of shock therapy. Instead of having a violent revolution, you could try and press and plead to Khamenei in the hope that he would loosen up some of the political controls that he's in charge of. But as I said earlier, he's doing the opposite. He has learned a lesson from the Shah in 1979 that when under pressure, you do not compromise. You go out there and you do what you have to do to stay in power. That's exactly what Khamenei is engaging in, perhaps with his mind preoccupied on the fact that he doesn't want to be the supreme leader, the second only supreme leader in the history of the Islamic Republic that squandered it all away. He got it on the silver platter. He didn't have to fight for it back in 1989. He spent 38 years basically pursuing policies that alienated vast majority of Iranians, and it was time for him to pass the baton to the next person. He had ruined it so much so that there was no prospect for a orderly succession. So I think that's one of the Khamenei fears, because everyone would recognize that he becomes his legacy. The one man who had the opportunity to sort of, maintain the capacity of the Islamic Republic to survive, he does the opposite. But that's where I think he's at right now. I would say, when I look at the reformist movement, the idea of gradual change in Iran, there's nobody that takes that seriously. We might wake up tomorrow, Patrick, and Ali Khamenei has done what the previous pope did, or one of the previous popes did, Pope Benedict, and gives up power, says, I'm too old, I can't figure this out anymore, I stay away, let somebody else come in, let Masoud Pezeshkian, the president, come in and do it. That would be a wonderful thing for him to do. I think the Iranian society might look at that as maybe the last resort and welcome it, because they obviously don't want a violent revolution or upheaval. But that's not Khamenei the man. Khamenei the man will fight to the very last minute, unfortunately, and the Iranian society and people have to pay the consequences.
Let me sneak in another thought right there. I mean, at his age, does the idea of immortality sneak in? Is he like some of the African rulers who think that they're going to live forever? Or, as a related question, what happens if he dies?
If that was for me, Patrick, very quickly, look, if he dies, again, the regime has an opportunity to reinvent itself, or try at least reinvent itself. I don't know. I mean, we don't know if the regime has the capacity to do so. We know there are lots of different fault lines inside this regime. But I think if I had to put my money on it, at least among the younger generation members of this regime, not looking at the ones in the back of pickup trucks who are machine gunning people down, because there's no hope for them, but the sort of so-called technocrats, others that are keeping the state machinery, they would have an opportunity to maybe reinvent themselves. And they can do that. But first thing they would need to do is to have a hard look at the conversation they're having with the Americans. There are things Iran can do to give Donald Trump something that he can lift up and say, this is different than Obama got in 2015. In other words, Iran can help Trump look a winner. And that's exactly what Trump wants. And then they can use that opportunity the moment they have to actually also have a dialogue with their own people. Iran has to. I mean, this seems time is up one way or another. It's a question of time and whether it's going to be bloody or not. But yeah, Khamenei, his father lived to, I think, 97. He could be around for another 10 years. So just waiting for him to die, that's no policy. And we know what the man's personality is in terms of very proud, extremely stubborn. But he also has shown to be willing to, when under pressure, give in. He said repeatedly, we're never going to negotiate with that man, meaning Donald Trump. And yet here they are, they're negotiating. So maybe he will give in, make some concessions. But I mean, I wouldn't hold my breath.
Ross, that's Alex just gave you the best segue into my question. How do both the U.S. and Iran currently assess the prospects for negotiations across the three key issues: Iran's nuclear program, its proxy networks, and its missile capabilities? Frankly, I think that's the toughest question and the most important one we may have here.
Yeah, well, I think to some degree I addressed some of those issues in the previous in my previous answer. I think the U.S. and Iran see the different files, and if in fact there is a negotiation to be had, or true negotiation, I think they see them very differently. I think that the Iranians clearly or have their back up against a wall in terms of the nuclear file. Whether they're, as Alex mentioned, whether they're willing to make some kind of a deal to suspend enrichment for the next couple of years, but retain the right under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which they do have, to enrich uranium at certain levels. Oh, and they negotiate that is something that is uncertain. It's hard to, at least it was hard to imagine 6 months ago, the Iranians ever negotiating away their right to enrichment. That was something that they had invested billions, or maybe tens or hundreds of billions of dollars in over the last number of years. And they have prestige. They had some certain amount of prestige at stake. And I think they saw a breakout capability, a threshold capability, as part of their deterrent structure. So there was hard to imagine them somehow voluntarily or negotiating that away. Situation has changed, obviously, since June, since the U.S. actually bombed the three major sites. And so how they're viewing the nuclear file in terms of their negotiation latitude, given the current geopolitical crisis they're in and domestic political crisis they're in, is really uncertain at this point. On the U.S. side, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's going to depend heavily on Donald Trump. If he believes that he can position a deal, assuming that there is a deal to be had. As I mentioned earlier, I'm not sure that this is a true negotiation. I don't think either side really sees it. But let's assume for a moment it is. I think he's got to be able to frame the nuclear file, or whatever he gets from the Iranians' nuclear file, is something better than he had before. And I think that's going to be a hard thing a hard circle to square, or square to circle to square. On the missile front, I don't see the Iranians giving in, maybe slightly on some range of missiles, but this is the only remaining deterrent they have. I mean, if it is in fact a deterrent, because they've potentially lost their sort of threshold capability, nuclear capability, as a result of the bombing that took place this past summer. And they have in many ways lost their axis of resistance. which is the third file. They lost the deterrent capacity of the axis of resistance. So the one piece, the centerpiece of their security doctrine, security strategy, is really their missile capabilities they've built up over a number of years. So I don't think there's going to be much flexibility on that one. The one area that they might be able to give that doesn't jeopardize themselves internally in terms of stimulating further protests and might be something that they can give without compromising security is the axis of resistance, their proxies. And the reason I say that is not because Hezbollah they're down, they're not out. So not that they're out and not that the Houthis are out, but the deterrent effect of Tehran's relationships with these proxies it's past its expiration date. The Israeli red lines have changed, and these proxies have shown over the last 2 years to be more of a liability to Iran's security rather than a deterrent asset. So I think that's one area where they might be able to at least claim that they're going to attenuate their support for some of these proxies. And frankly, I don't think that would hurt them at home either, because this sort of forward defense using their militias was not something that was popular. In fact, it was unpopular among large swaths of the population over the last 4 to 5 years. So that's one area perhaps they could give on. I think the important thing is it's extremely, and going back to this issue of bench strength, it's very difficult to negotiate a global deal that covers all three of the files. It's very difficult to do with a very experienced bench and with a long time frame. It's very difficult to do, maybe even impossible to do. Now, if you take a compressed timeline and the lack of bench strength on the U.S. side, I just don't see the ability to put those files together in any kind of a grand bargain, frankly. I mean, it's sad to say, but the Iranian bench is deeper in terms of institutional experience they bring to the table, because most of the folks that they bring to the table, including Aghashi, have been down this path before in terms of negotiation. So I'm very pessimistic that even if they can nail down agree on some of the modalities in some of these files, I think the distance is too great, certainly on the missile front and on the nuclear front, and the political constraints are there. And I just don't see, with the current timeline and the Armada sitting right off the coast, I just don't see these three files gaining any kind of traction in terms of further negotiations in any kind of a positive way.
I want to test a scenario or a point of view with the panel. Right now, we're all agreed that the U.S. side is essentially Trump negotiating through two other real estate developers who have only a limited grasp of what diplomatic negotiations are like. They still think they're negotiating a real estate deal in the outer boroughs. They don't seem to have much of a team with them, somebody that can explain what the difference between 3% and 2% or 4% enrichment really means. And they have Netanyahu beating the door down in Washington, demanding that we go to war now, all of which makes for a less than cohesive American approach to this. And it all goes back to the White House, and whatever decision is going to be made, at least in my opinion, will be a personal decision made upon the personal views of President Trump. I don't believe he wants to go to war. I think going to war would be an even bigger admission of failure than accepting a lesser transactional deal. My worry is that the Iranians haven't figured this out. The Iranians have a really competent, capable diplomatic team there, and they seem to still be operating on the assumption that the Americans are like they were in previous negotiations. Meanwhile, they too have a one-man leader whose view of his survival and success, and the survival of what he helped create, depends upon holding firm. But if the Iranians could come up with a transactional deal, I mean, the one that was bandied around with a couple of friends yesterday was that right now the Iranian enrichment program is going nowhere because the damage that was done What if they offer to put the program on hold for a couple of years while they continue to negotiate? Is this enough of a transaction or something else like that? Is it enough of a transaction for Trump to do what he did in Greenland, declare victory and sell it to his domestic base, which after all is what's driving all this, much of this in the first place, and go home? Any thoughts on that? Silence. Ross?
Yeah, I'll be happy to kick in. First of all, I'm not convinced the Greenland issue is dead at this point. I think it's sort of dormant. But
Yeah.
I think that I think I think Trump. I think you're probably right that Trump could agree to or take some kind of agreement on the part of the Iranians to suspend negotiation for a limited period of time as a victory. But I'm not sure that would go very well or play very well in Jerusalem. And I think so. I think Netanyahu is going to be breathing down his back against that kind of a deal. Is it something that the Gulf Arab states and Turkey and Egypt might buy? I think yes. I think anything that takes the pressure off a possible war in the Middle East that could spread and could have a contagion effect across the region would be positive for them. So that is certainly a possibility. But I think it's not just. I think what's missing here, Patrick, is not just the lack of technical expertise on the U.S. side. I think it's also the lack of clear understanding of the Iranian side. And the Iranians, I think, have a better take. You made a comment. You said the Iranians may be assuming that taking a play from the old playbook, that the U.S. is, and I'm not sure. I don't think that's true at all. I think that may have been true in June or April through June of last year. But I think they're onto the Americans, and that is that they really don't believe that this is a true negotiation. I think what they're playing for is putting pressure on the Gulf Arab states to put pressure on Trump, because the Iranians know that Trump listens to Saudi Arabia and the UAE and to Erdogan. I think they're putting pressure on them in order to forestall some kind of a military attack and frankly buy time. I think the Iranians are basically trying to if they can kick the can down the road and buy some time internally in terms of domestic, the lack of domestic unrest, and also kick the can down the road in terms of taking the pressure off militarily. I think they will do that. Whether that's something that the Israelis will see through, a deal that basically agrees to suspend rather than dismantle enrichment. I think they'll see through that, and I'm not sure that they will. I don't know how they will react to that, but I think the Iranians will do whatever they can to kick the can down the road. And I think Trump will try to, whatever deal whether it's military action or whether it's some kind of further diplomatic engagement, I think he'll try to put a positive spin on it and declare victory, at least for now.
I just want to add, Patrick, I always remind folks that this Islamic Republic has a tendency, going back to its founding, to make some pretty bad decisions. And you could start with taking the U.S. Embassy in November of '79, egging Saddam Hussein so much so that he invaded the country. And I could go on. And by the way, speaking of the Iran-Iraq war, which I think is relevant here, by 1982, Iran had kicked the Iraqis out of Iranian soil. Iran could have had ceasefire then. Iraq was ready for it. And yet Khomeini at the time took the country through another 6 years of war. And at the end of it, he had to sign that ceasefire anyway. Something similar is happening here. This nuclear program has been with us since at least 2003. So 23 years, trillions of dollars in damages. They keep trying the same thing again and again without changing any of their approach elsewhere. So oftentimes you have to ask yourself the question: why do you think the United States and Israel would want to deal with an entity that officially says it wants to kick the United States out of the Middle East and doesn't believe in Israel's right to exist? If that's your bottom line, then all the stuff about the get technical agreement done here and there, it's going to be temporary at best. It's the fundamentals that need to be looked at. An Islamic Republic under Khamenei refuses to look at the fundamentals. Ross earlier mentioned something which, if Iran was willing to look at the fundamentals, should help it steer itself in a different direction. And I agree with Ross. He said the proxies don't work anymore. Totally right. The proxies don't work. They're a liability. They've been a liability for a very long time. This whole idea that you have proxies so you fight your adversaries outside of Iran, not inside, that if that was ever true, it's no longer true today. So if you start looking at your proxies differently, if you start looking at Hezbollah and Hamas and so on differently, why would you not start looking at maybe Israel or US in the region differently? If you start doing that, that's where I think you're looking at a different Iran. Iran making a fundamental reassessment. And that might just open doors for something that's going to be more than just another technical agreement and buying time. And by the way, buying time for what? If you're sitting in Tehran, what are you buying time for? You have been infiltrated. You don't have the capacity to weaponize. The outside world will find out, will stop you. So why are you paying this price for so many years? Quarter of a century they've taken the country through hell to make a point. Like, I understand, to Ross's point, Iran has a right to enrich uranium. But when you have enrichment rights come together in the baggage with all these slogans that we know the Islamic Republic to be known for, this anti-status quo power, plus what they just did to their own people, the massacre that they engaged in, why would the outside world trust this regime? Which takes me to fundamental last point I make, Patrick. So you have a lot of people in Washington who are saying to Trump, listen, you don't want war, you don't have to go to war. This regime is so rotten, it just takes a few more, push here and there, and it will fall off the cliff. And maybe that's what you should aim for. Have them not continue to resume enrichment. You're sure that there is no Iranian nuclear weapon to be worried about, but then you refocus. You don't focus on diplomacy in Oman. You focus on how to bring the regime down from within. Huge undertaking. I see no signs of the administration thinking along those lines, but that is an option. Again, we know Trump, though. He hates nation-building projects. He thinks Iraq was the dumbest thing America did when George Bush invaded. But even that is what, I don't know if Netanyahu's going to tell him that, but I'm sure he will, that if you could turn Iran around, make Islamic Republic, something what it was before. I mean, Iran was before 1979. That would make history, Mr. Trump, and you stand to benefit in terms of name recognition. But again, I don't know where the man will go in terms of his Iran policy. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I agree. The last thing in his mind right now is trying to, in some way or other, build a new Iran or rebuild an old Iran. Dina, any thoughts on?
Yeah.
I'm particularly interested. Do you think the Iranians? Do you agree with Ross that the Iranians do understand what they're dealing with and are still making all those mistakes?
I actually do. I think the Iranians now have a pretty good grasp of who they're dealing with. I think they learned the hard way, and I think some of the outlines of a potential temporary deal that you outlined in the question is something that Iran actually had originally offered to the Americans a few months back. That idea of suspending enrichment has been on the table now for many months. The problem is that the Trump administration isn't biting because they want an end to enrichment. And they don't want to talk just about enrichment. They want to talk about the stockpile of enriched uranium, which is somewhere in Iran, that 400 kilograms. They want to talk about Iran's ballistic missiles. Again, I think that's a really key point for the Israelis. And I think that's something that Netanyahu is going to impress upon President Trump tomorrow when he comes to DC. The issue really is that the contours of that temporary deal that you've outlined has been on the table for a few months, but I think sadly we're far past it. We're no longer in a situation where the Iranians offering that is going to be enough. And as Alex said, there is an issue in terms of timeline, because let's say it works. Let's say Trump bites and they have this temporary deal, and the Iranians have bought themselves time. But bought themselves time to do what? They are out of tools to deal with any of the grievances that Iranian protesters have. They don't have any economic gives that they can give anymore. The reform program that they would have to put in place would actually worsen the economic situation before it improved it. And I don't think that Iranians could handle it getting any worse. They don't have the tools to deal with the political and social crisis. Last time when they had protests, They gave a little bit on the hijab, the Iranian headwear, a few months after the protest. They don't have anything that they can loosen up this time around that they don't view as critical and existential to the Islamic Republic. And even on the environmental front, they have no tools to deal with the environmental crisis that they're facing. So they're kind of facing this perfect storm that they don't have the means to deal with, which is why they're resorting to brute force right now and to buying time. But really the question that needs to be posed is buying time for what? Without significant sanctions relief from the United States. And I think without at least some parts of the system being pushed aside, I think you're unlikely to see any improvement.
Okay, that's an argument I've had difficulty to deal with. But the other thought that occurred to me as you were speaking, supposing what Trump offers back to the Iranians is just as minor as what the Iranians might offer to him on such a deal or something else. The Iranians say we're going to pause for a couple of years, and Trump essentially removes only the threat of attacking Iran and leaving the regime without the imminent American threat, which might in some small way unify the population, and yet still facing all these intractable problems that are eating away at the regime from within. Would that be a practical way for the president and the Iranians to proceed?
I'll jump in on the Iranian side before we go on to the US side. But on the Iranian side, I think that's a pretty perfect outcome for the Islamic Republic, because it would give them breathing room. It would give them a little bit of space to figure out the crisis that they're dealing with, what they're doing. Again, I don't think it will solve anything because I do think they're out of tools to deal with it, but it would give them a little bit of breathing room. And they wouldn't really have the specter of war hanging over their heads, which I think would be significant in itself. But at the end of the day, they will buy time in terms of the airstrikes, but then they will still be faced with this perfect storm internally. And they are not going to have that many ways to deal with it. So what is likely to happen under that scenario is that internally, every few months, you're going to get a group of Iranians that come out and protest and put pressure on the system. And every few months, you're going to get an equally violent crackdown. And that's going to continue for the foreseeable future. And on an external front, the Iranians are going to kind of go back into that pattern that they were in over the last few years, where they're going to try to negotiate with the US on their nuclear program in order to get some sanctions relief. And we're going to find ourselves in this bizarre, uncomfortable stalemate where none of the issues are really resolved.
We'll continue with that thought, and and the Greenland question, Ross. Greenland, there is no outcome yet to Greenland. We're still waiting for the other shoe to drop. Trump, in my view, clearly does not want to go to war. A year ago, I was told by friends in the Gulf that the Iranians have repeated the threat that if somebody tries to take out the regime, they will take out the export capacity of the Gulf, and there's nothing the Americans can do to stop it. I do know that there are a lot of people in the Gulf now looking for added anti-missile and anti-drone technology to put in place because they are scared. They are terrified that the Iranians are serious about the threat. And I don't think Trump wants a war that will close off the Gulf and could very well close off the Gulf, close off exports from the Gulf, and impoverish the Gulf states in a sense, and bring down the world economy. I mean, so Trump doesn't want that war. And a targeted strike under these circumstances is really hard to do. How do you actually, how do you calibrate one bomb won't start a war, two bombs will? So assuming Trump doesn't want to start a war, there's only two ways forward. Either the Israelis start the war for him because they're frustrated, and how does Trump react to Netanyahu in essence going behind his back and started the war, or we just stay in this permanent situation. I don't know how long I can keep an aircraft carrier in place and how you can deploy sort of a third of America's airstrike capability to the region sitting there doing nothing.
Yeah, well, that's the concern, I think, Patrick, is how do you de-escalate? So if Trump starts moving the SS Lincoln away, that indicates some kind of, not capitulation, but some kind of flexibility or backing down. I think you took the words out of my mouth when you said maybe the Israelis won't let him. They'll do some kind of a preemptive strike and either have a pre-agreement with Trump that if they're attacked, the U.S. will come to Israel's rescue, or they will just come in and actually, there's an agreement that the U.S. will pile on like they did this last June. But I think the other thing we have to look at is, I agree with you that Trump does not want a war, but we're assuming that that comment assumes that he's fully briefed and well briefed and has advisors that can kind of work him through some of the scenarios. I think that's the role the Gulf Arab states and Turkey's playing, trying to advise Trump on what some of the implications are of a military strike. But I do think he's also drunk a bit with this sort of these targeted strikes, that getting Maduro and the attacks on Iran with impunity last June. So I think he's a man of appetites, and I think my concern is that his appetite will overwhelm his reason, and hopefully there's enough counterforce in terms of reason in the region, if not by the Israelis, at least by the Gulf Arab states and Turkey, to back him away.
Ross, I've never once before like this hoped you were wrong on that one, or wish you were wrong.
Yeah.
So what happens? We're dragging in there. I personally don't believe that Netanyahu has got the. I was going to use a word in Spanish, but to go ahead and do this on his own. I think Netanyahu himself is sitting on such thin ice with Trump that Trump is just as likely to bomb Tel Aviv if he thinks that Netanyahu double-crossed him. But so where do we go? I see. I spent a lot of time with the U.S. military in my career, and tying up this quantity of assets, scaring our closest allies in the Gulf into saying, well, maybe you ought to go away and not come back again. This threat must be hanging there. The Iranians, meanwhile, are sitting on a powder keg that is taking all their energy to crush, and they're killing a lot of people. So they know that at some point in the finite future, Khamenei's dead, something's going to happen, and there are going to be a lot of people looking to kill them. Where does this go? I just see sort of, well, I don't see anything. I'm sort of at a loss if Trump doesn't cut a deal of some sort. And if the Iranians don't offer him a deal.
Patrick, very quickly, just to comment on that from me, Ross was talking about Venezuela option, and there's this idea of regime implosion. We know there are fault lines. We know a lot of people who have been rank and file of this regime can see this is not going anywhere pleasant, and the regime's time is up unless it's really willing to make fundamental changes. So there is the rupture inside the regime is a real possibility. Because it's happening already. Last time we saw anything like this was back in 2009. But is it going to bring the regime down? That is the big question. I don't think it will. I don't think, take the 12-day war and add another 4 rounds of a period on top of that. The regime can withstand airstrikes from above. And even lose many sites, strategic sites, nuclear missiles, and kill their own people. This is a regime that's fighting for its survival. They literally fear that they will be killed in a very horrendous way if the regime collapses. So they're not going to be able to jump on a plane and fly to California. They're fighting for their survival in many ways, which makes them extremely nasty in terms of their behavior towards their own people and willingness to take blows coming at them from the United States. What I think might make a difference, and again, I don't know where the Trump administration is at in terms of this policy idea, but you use kinetic action as part of a campaign, a systematic, organized, funded campaign that says the regime's time is up. Those people who are willing to recognize that and jump ship, defect. Again, I don't know if the comparison to Venezuela is apt, but there are plenty of people inside this regime without blood on their hands who can see killing young Iranians as a way of staying in power cannot be something you do forever and ever. So, in other words, you can't limit yourself to military strikes alone. You need to intellectually come up with something much more essentially ambitious, might look like nation building, but you want to let the Iranians be in the driver's seat. But again, you need to help the diaspora, the folks whose names we all know, who are the voices of the Iranian people today, to kind of connect, to link up with people who are willing and able, and when they defect.
Alex, I'm going to interrupt you and bring you to the end. We've crossed the time. Dina, you've are being crowded out by the rest of us, so you can close. Give you a couple of minutes to close, and then we all go home.
Okay, I'll be quick. I mean, I think the options don't look good, and I don't think there is any easy way out. I don't think that airstrikes on Iran is gonna topple the system. I just don't think it will. I think it risks splitting the population because Iranians, there are many that are against foreign intervention and many that are for it, and so I'm worried it will further polarize protesters and divide Iranians. And I don't think that would be a good outcome. But I will put my hands up and say, I also don't see any good outcomes in this situation. I think that for now, the system is too strong. There are ruptures within it, but the security forces seem to be very loyal to the system. And until security forces switch sides, then nothing is likely to happen. So I'm ending on a very pessimistic note, I'm afraid.
Okay, I'm going to close on a really pessimistic reminiscence. I was once dealing with a senior official of a Gulf state over a problem, and he turns to me and he says, I have 3 scenarios and they all turn out badly. Guys, this was a really good session. I'm sorry it turned out none of us had the magic to figure out how this ends. Thank you all very much. It was a great session, and see you soon.
Thank you, Patrick.
Take care.